on this anti-trans, cultural, like not cultural, but just on how much the right has dominated this narrative.
Yes.
There's been um, a certain capitulative nature from some on the progressive side, a lot of centrists, definitely. Some who I think maybe were part of the left, who say that, look, um, I agree with banning trans people in certain areas of like sports or maybe in a locker room. And if I can give the right and work, if I can give the right this win, that that'll be okay, because it'll seem like I understand that it is kind of crazy to allow trans people to be in a locker room. Are you kidding me? Or play in a Olympic sport? Yeah, and that somehow that will satiate the anti-trans bigots. But I think you've said now 3 times this phrase permission structure. That I think is a really important phrase, which is when or give a mouse a cookie, to quote one of my favorite children's books. If you give an inch onto something that is actually just morally wrong, I don't care whether you're like, your aunt is not ready for it, I don't give a shit, it's not just morally wrong, but
That's
also
why
it's like,
civil rights, this is why civil rights should not be something that people vote on. It should be something that is that's the law, that people should have equal access. And so they don't think of trans people as human. They just don't. I mean, so it's just, that's what's happened. And it's almost
so
like, sort of negotiating with terrorists. It's like
right.
you can't. I mean, it's like because they've made it clear. If you look at anything, and a lot of people aren't steeped in this like I am, so I've been following very closely for 20 years the progression of like legislation targeting trans people locally and on the state level. 26 states ban gender affirming care for trans young people. More than half the country at this point, and 24 states have sports bans, right? And it started with sports. They're not done. They're not done, and it's just it. When we capitulate, it just they're going to want more. You see, when you saw, I think if anybody who thinks they're going to be bipartisan with Republicans or where we agree, I was watching the Cenk, your interview with Cenk and the Mark Lamont Hill one.
Oh yeah,
brilliant. Like, just because you agree on this one thing, they are not. They're voting for the party that's not going to give them paid family leave, or that's not going to defund the Pentagon. They're not doing any of that. They're doing what they wrote in Project 2025. That's
exactly.
the agenda. Trying to find some agreement on some weird issues when these people don't fundamentally think you're human and that you're like crazy and like shouldn't exist. It's a non-starter. And so what we should be doing, I think, is trying to shore up our base, get through to the people that we can get through to. And there are a lot of people who are open and just don't know. I mean, I think it's been so easy to demonize trans people because a lot of people don't know trans people. There's so much misinformation. Literally, and I think Matt Cenk was responding to a Matt Walsh piece where Matt Walsh was calling out Cenk. I don't even know how to say it. Matt Walsh was like basically calling out Cenk's alleged pivot to the right.
Pivot.
And he was basically saying, and Cenk, in his response to Matt Walsh, said, "Do I agree giving hormone surgery to 2-year-olds? I don't agree to that." He said he used the term hormone surgeries to 2-year-olds, and it's like maybe he misspoke, but there's no such thing as hormone surgeries. No one is getting hormones at 2 years old. No one is getting surgery at 2 years old. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding. And so as someone who is deeply steeped in trans representation, and when people think about trans folks, still, and this has been the case since Christine Jorgensen, who was the first trans woman to become world famous in 1952, when she stepped off the plane from Denmark to a press conference as having had a sex change in 1953. The conversation about trans people has been about surgery and bodies, and I think the headline was "GI goes to blonde Jane," and the narrative was like this very masculine. Even though Christine Jorgensen wasn't masculine, she had served in the army, and so GI goes to blonde Jane. So the headline is this very masculine person going to this very feminine person surgically, and the narrative has been about surgery. I used to do a talk where I looked at TV talk shows and showed videos and for like 60 years, the conversation on TV talk shows is about surgery. What happens during the surgery? What happens during the hormone thing? And so when people think about trans folks, they think about surgery. And we have not, and even since I've had a public platform, I've been like saying over and over and over again, we have to take the narrative about trans people away from surgery and transition and focus on the lived experience and the humanity of trans people. Even when an interview has been humanized of a trans person, in my empirical research, when there is a conversation about surgery, the surgery becomes the takeaway. So then when it's time for the right wing to demonize trans people, and they say if they hear gender affirming care, they think surgery, because we haven't done enough work in the media and in terms of educating folks that transition, that gender affirming care for a prepubescent child, gender affirming care is therapy. It's maybe letting them grow their hair out and affirming their gender. It actually doesn't involve any hormones or any surgery.
Well,
that
let's actually,
it's bigger than surgery and hormones.
Well, there's even no, I think that's a really important point. And actually, there's a new study out of UCLA that basically says what you're saying, which is that like gender affirming care for youth is virtually non-existent. And again, roughly 0.1% of gender nonconforming teens use puberty blockers and or hormone therapy, and analysis over 5 million medical claims during this report. And so of the 5,155,282 medical claims, records analyzed 21 per 100,000 adolescents assigned female at birth and 15 per 100,000 adolescents assigned male at birth received puberty blockers. So it's minuscule. Report found that
1% of 1/10 of 1%.
Exactly. Some Bernie Sanders math over here. I mean, 20, you're looking at like, what is it? 40, less than 40, like 35 people per 200,000. So you're trying to legislate for the smallest minority. And yet I don't want to discredit how important those puberty blockers are to those 35 people. That going on puberty blockers, that when I have friends who have trans kids and they're like, oh, they just know. They knew when they were 3. They knew when they were 3.
I knew. Yeah. I knew. I've always known, and the world knew. That's it. Everybody knew. People were calling me a girl when I was in daycare, like five years old. My first interactions with kids. Sissy, F word, you're a girl. Why do you act like a girl? You're a girl. Like that. I was called a girl when I was a child, and then I transitioned, and now they call me a man. I've always that's the irony of my life. But like I knew, and what a difference. And someone asked me the other day, what if I had access to gender affirming care as a child? If I could have blocked this puberty that my deep voice that I've learned to embrace. I've learned to embrace my deep voice and broad shoulders and big hands and all that stuff. But like if I could have had...
Wait, you mean you'd be even hotter? I mean, like, I know we're using a very particular realm, but like that's kind of impossible, Laverne. I just want to say like...
my voice would not have... If I could have been on puberty blockers, my voice would be so... I'm going to use a colloquial term. My voice would be so cunt. Beyonce's made that word... copyright. My voice would be so cunt if I had access to gender affirming care to block the puberty that dropped my voice, and my transition would have been so much easier, and my life would have been easier. When you're the safety part of, as I know there's a model. I was at an event and I was sitting next to this model who I was a big fan of, and we were talking, and she was like, she was trans, and I had no idea she was trans, but she transitioned as a kid, and that the safety of being cis assumed is there's like nothing like it, especially now. Like what I'm telling
Yeah.
people, like trans young people now in this environment, if you can be stealth, I would just to survive, to stay safe, to
Yeah.
avoid violence and discrimination. I proudly, openly trans. I believe trans is beautiful. We are so beautiful and amazing and anointed. But for your safety, if you can be stealth, I think you
Yeah.
should be stealth. It's not an option for
Yeah.
everybody. So we need policies and we need safety and we need so many things. But I wish I had access to that care, but the reality is that we're still a very small portion of the population. They've whipped up, I mean, this whole contagion thing, and it's tied to and it's not unrelated to what the Christian nationalist agenda around the traditional family, around traditional gender roles. Because I
Yeah.
think if we acknowledge that gender and actually biological sex, even though that's a deeply problematic term, there's no such thing as biological sex technically, because we
Right.
can't,
Right.
how do we measure that? Because intersex people exist, right? So even
Right.
reproductive organs, genetics, it exists on a spectrum. It's not binary. So, but when we acknowledge that, then it's like all of these roles that we've kind of just placed men and women in, it's like, well, maybe that's arbitrary too. And there is an inherent threat that acknowledging the existence and the reality of trans people, that there is a kind of threat, and particularly our non-binary siblings, there's a threat to that gender binary and all of the gender norms that we've been given over time. I think that's beautiful, but there's obviously a group of people who have a huge problem with that and don't want that to happen. And that's part of a bigger part of how all this is also intersecting with, reproductive rights, getting rid of no
Yeah.
fault
And
divorce, etc.
exactly. They're coming for more. And so just to finish this whole discussion of like, if you give a mouse a cookie, if you concede on certain aspects, here's the thing. The people who say, okay, we should bar trans people from certain aspects of life, but no more. They often cite majority opinion, right? And they look at sort of where like the electorate is at and where how most people like don't think that trans people should be in like, professional sports or whatnot, as sort of rationale to why they hold their beliefs. It's not, and so what is your response to that? Like, well, look, I'm just going with majority opinion. Most people think it's weird. Ergo, this should be the line is yes, this is weird, that is not. Trans Olympians weird, but trans athletes in like to quote Jank, sort of like in high school, that's all good. Like, what is the problem with going with whatever majority opinion is?
Well, that majority opinion has been manufactured through well-funded right-wing propaganda. First of all, there was a different energy 10 years ago when trans people actually were able to kind of set the conversation and they didn't have an organized strategy. But I immediately think about when I was actually watching the Sarah McBride video, I immediately thought about that film Hidden Figures. When I don't know if you saw that film, there's a moment, there are these Black women working at NASA and Taraji had to go to the bathroom and she had to like go all the way, like she had to go like make this crazy journey to go to the bathroom. And at the time, it was majority opinion that Black people were inferior, that we should not be integrated with white folks, right? We should be in separate bathrooms. The majority of the country believed that Black people were inferior, that we were less than human, and that we should be segregated from white people. And they did everything they could to make that happen. The majority of the country believed that at the time. Was that right? Was that moral? Was that humane? Absolutely not. So the majority of people can have all sorts of ideas, but it doesn't make it right. And so we must, where is our moral compass? Where is our sense of right and wrong? And what are our values? What are we about? And I think that's what leftist and I say this to my, even though they may not identify as class reduction leftist, I think our class reduction leftist friends need to like think intersectionally more and think about what we are about and understand. There's so much political education that needs to happen. I think it's not a coincidence that Ron DeSantis in banning AP African American history in Florida cited intersectionality is something they're trying to teach. Do you remember that press conference?
Yeah.
Girl, that lives rent free in my brain because he said queer theory. They're like, what does queer theory have to do with AP African American history? That sounds like a political agenda and not education. And I'm sitting here as in my Black trans ass thinking, what about James Baldwin? What about Bayard Rustin? What about Nikki Giovanni? What about Pauli Murray? How do you talk about Black history and not talk about Bayard Rustin? A lot of people didn't know who Bayard Rustin was. Bayard Rustin, an openly gay man who organized the March on Washington, which is a pivotal point in African American history. He organized the March on Washington, a gay Black man. James Baldwin, a gay Black man, a pivotal figure in African American history. Pauli Murray, someone that a lot of people don't know about. I didn't know about till about maybe 5 years ago. Pauli Murray is a person who is Black, signed female at birth, and was a lawyer, actually co-founded the National Organization for Women with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of all things.
Oh my God.
And when she, I'll use she pronouns, when she went to law school, her thesis paper, Thurgood Marshall said, was his Bible for Brown versus Board of Education. Pauli Murray.
Damn.
Thurgood Marshall said her thesis paper for law school was his Bible for Brown versus Board of Education. There's a biography that came out called Jane Crow a few years ago that found letters where Pauli Murray, it suggested that Pauli Murray was seeking out testosterone treatments in the 1950s and possibly identified as trans. She certainly had relationships with women and had attraction to women. So at the very least, she was a queer woman, but probably trans and just couldn't get access to testosterone. It was easier to get estrogen in the 50s than testosterone. Pauli Murray, Kimberly Crenshaw said that her idea to coin the term intersectionality came from Pauli Murray's ideas, and the term Jane Crow was coined by Pauli Murray because Pauli Murray, in their lived experience, was like, I'm not just experiencing the world as a Black person, and the racism isn't just affecting me, sexism is affecting me, and it's affecting me in a specific way of this intersection of race and gender. And Kimberly Crenshaw, when she coined the term intersectionality, in the case that she cited, the discrimination case of the Black woman who was fired, she wasn't just fired because she was Black. She wasn't just fired because she was a woman. There was a specific way that race and gender were intersecting and how she was being discriminated against. So to talk about African American history and not include Pauli Murray is a problem. So yes, then you do need to talk about queer studies when you talk about AP African American history.
It is intersectional. Ron DeSantis learning about intersectionality.
It has to be intersectional, but they don't want to teach that because they don't want, they don't want an educated populace either.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do